Although you may not acknowledge them, there are more pronouns than he, she in this big, beautiful world. Good morning, Miss Harris. Shiloh smiled as they walked up to the hospital bed. Good morning, dear, the old woman said, looking out of the window. Her face was expressionless, and Shiloh could already tell it was going to be a long day. The old woman had wispy white hair, wrinkles all over her face, and translucent skin through which her thin veins could be seen. She had a small frame and was skinny. The bed she was laying in was 2 times her size. It's time for breakfast, Miss Harris. What would you like? Shiloh asked with a half smile and a concerned look. Nothing, dear. I'm not hungry. You have to eat something. You'll wither away, Shiloh insisted. With this, Miss Harris turned away from the window and looked up into Shiloh's eyes. Wither away. Have you seen me lately? There's nothing left to wither. Well, how about I give you a few minutes to look over this morning's menu and I'll come back, Shiloh suggested. That's fine, dear, Miss Harris replied, taking the menu. As Shiloh walked out, Miss Harris placed the menu on the table next to her bed and turned her head once again to face the window. 3 hours had passed and Shiloh still hadn't heard from Miss Harris. While they were concerned, the woman had barely eaten anything during her 3 months under their care. They had come to expect her to go days without eating, yet somehow remained strong. While Shiloh and Miss Harris hadn't known each other very long, they had a rapport with each other. Miss Harris recognized Shiloh as their primary nurse. She would even ask how they were, giving thoughtful replies if they let it slip that the day was difficult. However, Shiloh knew little to nothing about Miss Harris, aside from the fact that she didn't eat. They decided this was something they wanted to change. Maybe, if they got to know her a bit better, they could convince her to eat. After their lunch break, Shiloh decided to learn more about Miss Harris. They were determined to make her last few weeks on Earth more bearable than they would be otherwise. Hey there, Miss Harris. How are you doing? Dying. How are you? She snapped back. I'm doing all right, Shiloh replied, trying to remain confident. I was just on my lunch break, thinking about you. Well, isn't that the sweetest thing? Miss Harris replied in a mocking tone. I was just thinking about the fact that I don't really know you. I'd love to sit and chat about your life if you'd take the time. Miss Harris's face morphed from perturbed to pleasantly surprised. No one ever cares enough to listen to me. Well, I do. I'd love to get to know you. After a moment's pause, Miss Harris agreed to talk with Shiloh. They pulled up the chair next to the hospital bed and perched their elbows on the armrests, leaning forward to listen. I suppose I can begin where I grew up. It was on a small farm in the town of Wurzburg, Germany. Shiloh looked visibly surprised. I lost my accent when I moved to the States as a young girl. My family lived a happy, luxurious life in a mansion and everything. Miss Harris's eyes brightened as she recalled the memory. But, like every dream, nightmares are often mixed in. My father, a pilot fighting for Germany, was shot and killed on the battlefield. My mother and I were devastated. In an effort to cheer her up, I would often care for the house and cook dinner for us. This meant that I was kept from school and therefore didn't make many friends. I was left to wander around on my own, making up my own adventures. One day, I was meandering through the woods behind my house when I came across a deserted cabin. It was farther than I had ever been from the house, so I had never seen it before. When I approached the door, a woman with tattered clothes and matted hair stepped out. her back hunched over as she came up to me, and she looked into my eyes. Suddenly, the most terrifying thing happened. Her eyes went completely black. Her teeth elongated in her mouth and grew into sharp spikes, and she lunged at me. Shiloh was on the edge of their seat, clutching the armrests with white knuckles. "This is unbelievable. A crazy lady in the woods attacked you, and you're still here. How did you get away?" I ran towards my house. She followed me with inhuman speed and was always right behind me. If I had stopped, she would have gotten me. Thankfully, I was now nearing a part of the woods I recognized. I jumped over a ledge down into a small cave my brother and I would play in. Since the woman was so close, she didn't have time to jump. She fell over the ledge and hit her head on a rock right in front of me. Blood poured from the wound and covered the ground. It was horrifying, an image I've never forgotten. "I can tell," Shiloh said. "That must have been so scary. What happened after that? How did you come to the States?" "Well," Miss Harris started to say, but she was interrupted by a knock at the door. "Goodness, there you are." It was their supervisor, Mike. "I've been looking for you all afternoon. Mr. Gordon needs his enema in 15 minutes. Shiloh did their best to refrain from heaving a deep, frustrated sigh. "Fine, but, Miss Harris, I'll be back for my dinner break to hear the rest of your stories." Miss Harris smiled. "I look forward to seeing you then." Mike and Shiloh walked down the hall together toward Mr. Gordon's room. "When you're done with this, there are flyers at the nurse's station that I need you to put up." Shiloh knew they would be reprimanded if they put up a fight, so they nodded and headed into Mr. Gordon's room, ignoring Mike's sarcastic wave. Shiloh walked over to the nurse's station after they were done with Mr. Gordon. "Hey, Shiloh," Susan, a fellow nurse, said as they approached the desk. "Hey," Shiloh replied. "Mike left these for you." Susan gestured to a stack of multicolored neon paper. Shiloh let slip a huge sigh. There had to have been about 200 flyers in the stack, and they were anxious to hear the rest of Miss Harris's story. "You know you're just going to get your ass handed to you if you don't do this," Susan responded with an attitude. With another sigh, Shiloh picked up the flyers and walked away. On each piece of paper, written in bold blocky letters, there were the words, "St. Paul's Church Boys Choir." Underneath there was a grainy black and white picture of a boys' choir. The time and date were listed underneath the photo, as well as information about which recreation hall they would be performing in. Shiloh made their way down the halls of the retirement home, stapling flyers to bulletin boards and taping them to walls until their mundane job was completed. As soon as they hung the last poster, they scurried back to Miss Harris's room. "Shiloh, I was wondering when you'd be back," Miss Harris said sweetly once Shiloh entered the room. "Hey, Miss Harris. I had some flyers to hang up before I came back, but I'm excited to hear the rest of your story." Shiloh sat down in the chair that was still next to Miss Harris's bed. "So what happened after that crazy lady fell from that ledge?" "Well, I thought she was dead. Once she fell, blood was just pouring from the wound on her head. But when I tried to step over her to get out of the cave, she grabbed my ankle and chomped down on my leg with these long, sharp teeth." "She bit you?" Shiloh cried a little too loudly. "Yes, I kicked her off my leg so hard she hit her head again and died instantly. I checked that last time and she was definitely gone." "Wow, that must have been traumatizing," Shiloh replied, flabbergasted. "It sure was, but that wasn't the worst part." Miss Harris trailed off and looked at Shiloh with a serious expression. "I'm not sure I should tell you." "Tell me what?" "I'm sure it's nothing I haven't heard before. You got some kind of disease from her biting you, right?" "I'm a nurse. I've seen it all," Shiloh replied with an air of confidence. "Well, all right. But I don't want this getting around. I know how chatty you nurses can be." Shiloh held up 3 fingers and held their other hand over their heart. Scout's honor. Miss Harris's shoulders relaxed a bit, and she leaned in closely to Shiloh. The sweet scent of baby powder and cold cream filled their nostrils. "I was cursed," she said. "Cursed?" Shiloh repeated, sitting back in their chair. "Yes. The woman I met in the woods had the same curse, and when I killed her, it passed on to me." "That's insane. How did you find that out?" Shiloh asked. "One day, soon after my leg had healed, some men broke into our house and took my mother and I. At the time, there were many women in my town accused of witchcraft. Because we were women, they grouped us in with them. When we arrived at the town square, there were women and children lined up, their wrists bound with ropes and their mouths gagged. The men of the town were power-hungry and were killing women and children by the hundreds. They beheaded them, burned them at the stake, and publicly humiliated them in the town square." Shiloh's face shifted from shocked to confused. "Witch trials? Those haven't happened since the 1600s. "I'm 402 years old, Shiloh," Miss Harris whispered. "It's part of my curse." Shiloh's mouth dropped open, and a sick feeling developed in their stomach. Suddenly they were anxious and sat back in the chair, creating as much space as they could between themselves and Miss Harris. After a moment of awkward silence, Miss Harris continued. "While my mother and I were being bound, I noticed some children near me. They seemed to have a smell that I'd never noticed. For some reason it was irresistible. My eyes began to hurt, and I felt my teeth stretch in my mouth. The man standing over me with the gag in his hands looked terrified, but I couldn't understand why, until I suddenly ripped the ropes from my wrists and lunged for the children. It was like I couldn't stop myself. No one was brave enough to stop me, and the children were bound and unable to move. I caught them, ripped their hearts from their chests, and bit into them. It was almost an out-of-body experience. But I remember that first time, like I remember all the others." "The others?" Shiloh asked. "Yes, there have been many. I use the hearts of children to stay alive and young." "But you're old and dying," Shiloh said. "When I ended up here, away from children, I started to age rapidly. I'm done living. I've been around for so long. I'm tired of having to do these horrible things to survive. So I just stay here, away from the world and from children." I have to go," Shiloh said, rising from their seat. I think I hear Mike paging me." Miss Harris's face fell, and she instantly regretted revealing her secret to Shiloh. "Oh, all right, dear. We'll catch up later then?" Miss Harris asked, attempting to gauge Shiloh's hesitancy. Yeah, I'll see if I have some free time later today." Shiloh spent the rest of their day walking the halls of the retirement home with nothing to do. Nervously, they paced the hallways and chewed on their nails, taking down whatever flyers they could around Miss Harris's room. They wanted to make sure she never found out about the boys' choir. They knew they would have to return to her room later that evening to give Miss Harris her nightly meds, and they were dreading the moment they had to face her again. Knowing what she was capable of changed Shiloh's impression of the sarcastic old woman completely. Shiloh knew they couldn't tell anyone else. No one would believe them, and the other nurses would just have another reason not to like them. They knew they had to do something drastic. They knew they had to keep these kids safe. Later that night, Shiloh's anxiety was at an all-time high. They had conjured a plan and were ready to follow through with it. They had made sure to keep all information about the visiting choir a secret and had hovered around Miss Harris's room to make sure no one mentioned it as they came in to check on her. Shiloh entered Miss Harris's room with her nighttime meds and took a deep breath as they passed through the door. They looked right at Miss Harris and noticed something was off. The lights were dimmed more than normal, and a strained growling noise could be heard coming from the direction of Miss Harris's bed. Shiloh flipped the switch next to the door. Miss Harris was facing away from them, but shaking her body in an unsettling way. Shiloh made their way to the other side of the bed to see if Miss Harris was all right, but instead of seeing the old woman vomiting like they had expected, they saw a bloody mess. The body of a young boy in choir robes laid next to the bed on the floor, his chest scratched open with sharp claws and teeth. Miss Harris turned to see Shiloh standing next to the bed. Her eyes were black orbs sunken into her face, and her top and bottom row of teeth had elongated into needle-sharp spikes. Blood covered her mouth, her nightgown, and the sheets on the side of the bed. Shiloh stood sentient and was too dumbstruck to say anything. Suddenly, Miss Harris said, "Shiloh, dear, did you know there was going to be a choir performance here in a few days? These lovely boys have stopped by for their dress rehearsal." Shiloh tried to speak, but rather than words, all that escaped their lips was a scream of rage. Without a second thought, they reached to their left, picked up a flower pot from the window sill, and threw it at Miss Harris. It shattered on her head and cut through her temple. Blood ran down her face. She laid back, the boy's small heart hitting the floor with a wet splat. Her eyes began to normalize and her teeth shrunk back down. Her eyes looked straight at Shiloh. She smiled serenely and closed her eye. As Shiloh left to tell someone about what had happened, they passed one of the recreation rooms. The sound of rehearsing boys' choir could be heard through the large doors. As Shiloh left to tell someone about what had happened, they passed one of the recreation rooms. The sound of the rehearsing boys' choir could be heard through the large doors. Shiloh smiled as they passed by, but were stopped short in their tracks when they felt their eyes become sore and their teeth elongate within their mouth. The scent now, wafting through the door, filled their nostrils, and they emitted a satisfying growl. The rec room doors swung shut on their own as Shiloh burst through them, and the screams and cries of young boys rang out through the nursing home. Number 2. The Retreat. "Please, do it for me," exclaimed Ellen, my best friend, kneeling on the floor before me with her hands clasped together. She was nearing the end of her efforts to invite me to a woman's retreat at her church. "I'm not religious. I wouldn't get anything out of it," I said for at least the second time since she'd started asking. "You'd get my undying love and affection," she mumbled into her fingers, her large brown eyes looking up at me. She had been attempting to invite me for the past week, and as the weekend of the event slowly approached, she became more persistent. "My sister and my mom are both going, but my sister's friend is going with her, and I don't want to sit with my mom the whole time. Please, please, please come." She was tugging at the hem of my jeans now, nearly pulling them down. I looked at the ceiling of my bedroom and pinched my eyes with my forefinger and thumb. Knowing there was no excuse in the book she hadn't heard by now, I mumbled, "Fine." Ellen jumped up and hugged me. She immediately took to my closet and started packing a duffel bag for me. Ellen came to pick me up the following day. Her black coupe with a large dent on the passenger side rumbled and shook as it pulled up outside of my apartment building. She helped me load up my belongings and we took off towards our destination. The drive was beautiful. The chilly fall air blew through the small car and the changing leaves became brighter and more colorful as we traveled up towards the mountains. We arrived before dinner was scheduled, and in the meantime, we found our room and unpacked. The facility was a small group of cabins set back from the main road amid the tall trees. There were several cabins surrounding a mess hall that looked like one of the cabins had been elongated. Ellen and I arrived at the mess hall about 20 minutes before dinner was scheduled to happen. She and I wandered around a bit outside before taking our seats. It was a beautiful campus. The cabins were traditional and rustic, made with real logs. The forest floor was an amalgam of dead pine needles and rocky soil, with the occasional bright orange fall foliage peeking through. Leading from the mess hall door to each cabin's entrance, there was a sparse stone path. It was quaint, peaceful, beautiful, and though I was anxious to be surrounded by the fact that I was at a religious retreat, I was soothed and felt comfortable. Dinner was buffet style. There were chicken thighs, vegetables, and assorted side dishes. It was better than you might expect canned food to be, but not a 5-star meal by any stretch of the imagination. Ellen and I both felt nauseous after we ate and sneaked away to our room to eat the snacks we had brought with us. Once dinner was officially over, the first of a weekend of messages was scheduled to begin. I had very little experience with church groups before this weekend. When I was younger, my parents would take me to their Baptist church with them and stick me in Sunday school, but I was never interested enough to keep it all going once high school rolled around. Since then, I suppose I considered myself to be agnostic. Ellen and I took our seats next to the other family members in uncomfortably cushioned folding chairs behind pop-up tables adorned with burlap runners, pumpkins, and cinnamon sticks. We sat in the second row from a small stage decorated with larger versions of the same false stereotypes on our tables. A hush fell over the room as a stout woman with dark hair and small eyes climbed the 3 steps. The book she carried with some effort was much larger than any Bible I had ever seen, and seemed to have textured covering around the hard cover. She hoisted it up onto a podium and opened it to a page near the front. "Good evening, ladies," she spoke. Her voice was loud and reverberated against the walls of the mess hall. "Our God is good in all He does." The congregation replied with a simultaneous "Amen." I looked around, a bit confused. "He is the sole reason we are here this weekend, and I am happy to say He has brought us a suitable sacrificial being for each day." She looked at a young girl cowering in the corner, at me, then at Ellen's sister's friend. I looked at Ellen and whispered, "What does that mean?" She looked at me like I had 3 heads and ignored my question. After a brief pause, candles that I had not previously noticed suddenly lit in unison on window sills, the steps of the stage, lining the walls, and on our tables. I looked around to see if any of the other women were as flabbergasted as I was. None of them were. Some seemed to be praying, others intently focused on the speaker. The stout woman began humming something that sounded like Spanish, maybe Latin. There was a space behind where all the tables had been set up where there was a small carpet covering the wooden planks of the floor. Without any indication, each woman stood up and surrounded the square carpet in a circle. Not wanting to be left out, I followed and stood next to Ellen and another woman I didn't know. The stout woman came down from the stage, and before she passed through the circle of women, she thrust her hand in the air, and the carpet was scrunched up and pulled out of the way by the women closest to it. There was a large black pentagram painted onto the floor. My jaw dropped, and I immediately wanted to leave. I leaned over to Ellen and said, "I'm going to the bathroom. Be right back." She didn't seem to hear me, and as I was about to go anyway, each woman grasped the hands of the women beside them. Ellen gripped mine tightly, and I knew I would just have to grin and bear it. I started thinking of maladies that could happen overnight and warrant an Uber home as soon as tonight. The stout woman circled around the women, touching them lightly on the shoulder as she passed. She started with Ellen, and when she got to me, she stopped. Her eyes seemed to be a dark red, though it was difficult to tell in the simple candlelight. Her long dark hair framed her pointed face in a way that made her seem sinister. She grabbed the hand that was holding Ellen's, scratching my wrist with long red fingernails, and brought me to the center of the circle. "What is your name?" she asked me. I looked at her with wide eyes. "Devon," I said quietly, knowing an escape would likely be impossible. She looked down into her large book and said, "O great and mighty Lucifer, we bring you Devon as a suitable sacrifice, so that you may bless this weekend and bring us closer to you and to the end of times when we may fight by your side against the evil ones." I looked at Ellen. She was picking at the dirt under her nail, seemingly bored. "Ellen, are you going to do anything?" I shouted at her. "About what?" she replied. "Why did you think I invited you?"